Logan wasn't even thinking about work anymore. It was hour 10 of a 12-hour shift, and his brain was already halfway home, thinking about the leftover Chinese in his fridge, the aching need for a shower, and the cold beer waiting for him on his couch. Then the radio crackled. Unit 5, respond to a vehicle versus pedestrian. Victim is a child. Driver fled the scene. Instantly, his stomach turned to ice. He glanced at Mason. His partner had the same dead serious look on his face. Neither of them needed to say a word. Mason flicked on the sirens and the ambulance lunged forward. The dispatcher's voice came through again, this time with an edge of urgency. Victim is an 8-year-old female, unconscious, suspected severe head trauma. Logan tightened his grip on the radio. ETA 3 minutes. That was 3 minutes too long. They pulled up to chaos. A mangled pink bicycle lay in the middle of the street, its tiny white wheels still spinning. A woman, the mother, was on her knees, shaking, screaming, and in front of her. The little girl lay motionless on the pavement. Blood pooled beneath her head. Her arm was twisted unnaturally. Logan's feet hit the ground before the ambulance even came to a full stop. "Mason, get the bag. Now!" The mother was screaming, rocking back and forth, hands clutching at the girl's tiny frame. "Baby, wake up, please, please!" Logan dropped to his knees, his hands already moving, feeling for a pulse. Weak, barely there. But it was something. "Mason!" Mason skidded next to him, already ripping open the medical bag. Logan's eyes swept the girl's injuries. Blunt force trauma to the skull, road rash, possible internal bleeding. She wasn't breathing on her own. Her body was trying to shut down. Logan grabbed the bag valve mask and forced air into her tiny, fragile lungs. "Come on, kid, stay with me." Logan worked fast, too fast. He didn't have a choice. The little girl's chest barely moved under the force of the bag valve mask as he squeezed in air, his fingers gripping her fragile jaw to keep her airway open. She was so small, too small to be lying on the pavement like this, too small to have her body twisted like a broken doll. Mason was a blur of motion beside him, tearing open medical packs, securing an IV in the girl's tiny arm. The mother sobbed uncontrollably. "She was just riding her bike," she gasped, as if saying it enough times would change reality. Logan forced the thought out of his head. He had no time for grief. Not now. He checked her pulse again, still weak. Slipping. His hand shook as he reached for the radio. "Dispatch, we need immediate police backup. Hit-and-run suspect is still at large. Child is critical. We're transporting now." "Copy that, Unit 5. Logan glanced up. Where the hell were the cops? Didn't matter. They couldn't wait. "We gotta move her," he told Mason. "Now." They worked as one. Mason secured her C-spine. Logan lifted her tiny, broken body onto the stretcher. The moment she was in the ambulance, Mason jumped into the driver's seat. Logan barely had time to slam the doors shut before the ambulance was tearing down the road, sirens screaming. Inside the rig, Logan's world narrowed. Her vitals were crashing. Her breathing was getting shallower. Blood leaked from a wound at her temple, staining the stretcher beneath her head. Mason's voice came through the radio from the front. ETA 7 minutes. 7 minutes? She didn't have 7 minutes. Logan tightened the mask over her face, forcing oxygen into her tiny lungs. "Come on, baby, stay with me." The monitor screamed, heart rate dropping, blood pressure plummeting. "Damn it, she's tanking," Logan muttered. He ripped open another dose of epinephrine, plunging the syringe into her IV line. "Fight, kid, just fight a little longer." The mother's sobs filled the back of the rig, gasping out prayers that Logan didn't have the heart to stop her from saying, because even he was praying now. But God wasn't answering. Logan's hands moved on instinct, but his mind was racing. Everything was going wrong. The girl's pulse was fading beneath his fingertips, her fragile body barely responding. The monitor flatlined for a split second. Then, a weak, erratic rhythm returned. Not good, not even close. He pressed the radio. "Mason, what's our ETA?" 5 minutes. Too damn long. The mother clutched at Logan's sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's gonna be okay, right?" Logan didn't answer, didn't look at her, because he couldn't. If he did, she'd see the truth written all over his face. Instead, he focused on the girl, on the rising and falling of her tiny chest, on the ragged breaths he was forcing into her lungs, on the way her eyes remained closed, unmoving, unresponsive. "Come on, baby," he whispered under his breath. "You're almost there. Just a few more minutes, just a little longer." The longest 5 minutes of Logan's life. The siren screamed, Mason pushed the ambulance to its limits, but Logan still felt like they were moving too damn slow. He didn't stop bagging her, didn't stop adjusting the IV, didn't stop checking her vitals every damn second, because if he stopped, if he let up for even a moment, she'd slip away, and he wouldn't let that happen. Couldn't. The mother's prayers turned to pleading. She reached out, fingers brushing against her daughter's limp, bloodied hand. "She's so cold," she whimpered. "Why is she so cold?" Logan swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper. Because she was going into shock. Because her body was already failing. Because she didn't have much time left. And he knew it. Hospital in sight. 1 minute out. "We're almost there, baby," the mother sobbed. "We're almost there." The monitor wailed. "Flatline." Logan's heart stopped. "No, no, no!" Mason pulled into the ER bay like he was on 2 wheels, slamming the brakes as Logan grabbed the defibrillator. One shock. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. Logan's hands clenched into fists. "No, not now." The doors flew open, ER doctors and nurses swarming them. 8-year-old female struck by vehicle, cardiac arrest en route, Logan shouted as they rushed her into the trauma bay. And then, she was out of his hands, gone. And all Logan could do was stand there, watching, feeling completely, utterly helpless. Logan stood frozen in the hospital hallway, blood-streaked gloves hanging at his sides. The ER team had taken her. She was gone, pulled from his hands, rushed through those sliding doors, swallowed up in a blur of white coats and shouting nurses. His job was done, but his hands still felt warm with her blood. The mother's screams still echoed in his ears, and Logan knew in his bones that she wasn't coming back. Mason clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Come on, man, let's clean up." Logan didn't move, couldn't. His feet felt bolted to the floor, because deep inside him, there was still some delusional part of himself that wanted to believe, just for a second, that maybe somehow the ER team could pull off a miracle. Maybe she'd survive. Maybe they hadn't just watched an 8-year-old die in the back of their rig, but he knew better. He had seen too many faces like hers, too many tiny bodies go limp under his hands, too many times where he did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. The trauma room was a hurricane of movement. Doctors calling out vitals, nurses scrambling to push fluids, and attending yelling for a crash cart. Through the open doorway, Logan could see the mother. She was on the floor, arms wrapped around herself, shaking violently, watching them try to bring her little girl back. The sound she made, it wasn't a scream. It was something worse. It was a sound of complete and total devastation. The sound of a mother breaking. Logan turned away. He couldn't watch this anymore, because he knew how it would end. 7 minutes later, a nurse came out. She wasn't crying. She didn't have to. She just looked at Logan and Mason, her face pale and exhausted, and shook her head. The little girl was gone. The doctors had tried, pushed every med, every shock, every desperate intervention, but she never came back. Time of death, 3:27 p.m. Mason exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. Shit. Logan just stared. He had known. From the moment he saw her on the pavement, he had known. And it still hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. The nurse hesitated. "The mom, she wants to see her." Logan's throat tightened. Because that part? That was always the worst. They let the mother in. She collapsed beside the hospital bed, clutching her little girl's limp, lifeless hand, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Logan watched from the hallway, felt his stomach churn as she whispered her daughter's name, over and over again, as if saying it enough times could undo what had happened, as if it could bring her back. Logan wanted to walk away, wanted to rip off his gloves, climb back in the rig, and pretend this was just another call, but his feet wouldn't move, because his brain kept replaying every second of that call. What if I'd gotten there faster? What if I'd done something different? What if I could have saved her? Logan sat in the back of the ambulance, staring at his hands. The blood was gone, scrubbed off in the ER sink, but he could still feel it. Still see the little girl's pale, lifeless body beneath his hands as he pumped her tiny chest, desperately trying to force her heart to keep beating. He flexed his fingers, but the phantom sensation didn't leave. Mason climbed into the rig, silent for once. He had the look, the same one he always got after a bad call, but this one was worse. Because this wasn't just a bad call. This was the kind that stuck, the kind that left a scar. Mason sighed, rubbing his face. We did everything we could. Logan barely heard him, because everything we could still wasn't enough. The radio crackled. Unit 5, status update. Mason grabbed it. Back in service. His voice was flat, emotionless. Logan barely kept himself from scoffing. Back in service. Like this was just another shift. Just another call. Like a little girl hadn't just died in their hands. Like her mother's screams weren't still rattling in his skull. Logan swallowed hard. We got any more calls? Mason shook his head. Relief should have come. It didn't. Because that meant all they had left to do was sit in this goddamn ambulance, staring at the blood-streaked stretcher, pretending like their hands weren't still shaking. The station was quiet when they got back. Too quiet. Logan kept moving. He tossed his gloves, stripped off his uniform jacket, scrubbed his hands again, but it didn't help. The blood was gone, but the guilt wasn't, and it never would be. Mason leaned against the sink beside him, crossing his arms. You good? Logan let out a humorless laugh. No. Mason nodded, as if that was the only answer he had expected. Yeah, he muttered. Me neither. Logan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. The pink bike, the tiny broken body, the wide, unseeing eyes. At 2 a.m., he gave up. He sat on his couch in the dark, staring at nothing, his mind still trapped on that stretch of asphalt, in the back of that ambulance, in that ER room where a mother's world had shattered. He ran a hand over his face. It shouldn't still hurt this bad. He'd seen death 100 times before. But this one felt different. This one was different. Because it wasn't just a loss, it was a failure. The next day, Logan drove past the accident scene. It was clean now. No blood, no wreckage, just an empty stretch of road that didn't look like it had swallowed a little girl whole. But something was different. On the sidewalk near the curb where she had fallen, someone had left a small memorial, a cross, a bouquet of flowers, a stuffed animal, its fur soaked from last night's rain. And the bike, the pink twisted wreckage of her bicycle, leaned up against a streetlight like a ghost of what had happened. Logan's chest tightened. He should drive away. Instead, he pulled over. He got out. And for the first time since she had died, he let himself feel it. He let the weight hit him full force. Because no matter how many shifts passed, how many calls came after this one would always stay.